Hi, good morning, everyone. Really appreciate you making it to the earliest slot in the conference and waking up early and beating the lights outside. So thank you for being with us now. We're really excited to talk today about multi-stage threat detection with MITRE and Amazon GuardDuty. I'm Shahar. I help customers detect threats in their cloud environment, and I work at AWS as a product manager for Amazon GuardDuty.
Hi, everyone. I'm Pratima Singh. I'm a solutions architect at AWS, and previous to being a solutions architect, I was a security specialist SA. I work with capital markets customers down under, that's in Australia, so I've come all the way to talk to you about the session today. So good to see you here.
And hello, my name is Shane Steiger. I'm with MITRE Corporation. I'm a principal cybersecurity engineer. I work within the cyber resiliency team, but I also do work for Engage in the cyber deception space, as well as for attack and others.
So to set the foundation, I'll walk you through a multi-stage threat. We will then hear from Shane how the MITRE frameworks, specifically attack, defend, and engage, work towards detection and remediation of such threats. And then we will have Sahar, who will come in and talk to us about how you can do the same with automated features from Amazon GuardDuty, especially the extended threat detection features. Now let us start with a cloud workload. A typical cloud workload is basically composed of a set of permissions. Now, these permissions are set through AWS Identity and Access Management Service, or AWS IAM. Then you have the compute engine. You could use different types of compute that churn business logic to secure the data or access the data that's sitting in your data stores. Now, these are your crown jewels. At the end of it, what are you trying to secure is your data, is your customer's information. Now, when we look at a threat chain, it all starts with a threat actor, an adversary that is trying to gain access to your information. They don't much care about what compute you run. All they care about is how they can get access to your data. Now, they run a scan to start with to look into ways that they can access the infrastructure that you have deployed in your environment. Now, this is the first step in the threat chain. This step is called reconnaissance. This is where the threat chain starts. Now, say the threat actor succeeds. You've got access keys stored in your CI/CD tools, or you've got access keys that were committed to your code repositories, and they're able to retrieve those access keys or credentials, and they're able to use those credentials to establish the level of permissions they have. So what can they do in your environment? The threat now moves to the initial access step. Say they've been able to establish, because these credentials were associated with your CI/CD tools that deploy infrastructure to environments, so they have elevated privileges. So they end up creating new credentials with a lot more privileges that these credentials, the previous credentials, could offer. Now we're moving the threat to the credential access stage. Now the threat actor can then add permission to create new resources or create new IAM roles and also access your data through those new resources that they have created. Now this leads to a privilege escalation stage. Now from here, a series of events will kick off. They're able to, with those new permissions that they have set up, the threat actor is now able to establish persistence. They're able to set up compute resources, say an AWS Lambda function, give it permissions to access your data stores, your S3 buckets, your DynamoDB tables, or your RDS databases. And of course, through the Lambda function, they're able to pull that data out. In this example, I've picked an S3 bucket. They're able to pull data from the S3 bucket and finally exfiltrate those files that may contain protected information, like personally identifiable information, or PII, or even healthcare information if you are a healthcare business. And this is information of the customers of your business. Now, once they have hold of your data, the threat chain is effectively complete. When you do review the events that have followed, that have happened in the past, it emphasizes the value of having layered security controls. So not just a singular control to protect a certain step, but having it in multiple layers ensures that even if certain layers are passed through, you have the right protections through. Now, such tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, this is just an example, right? They are a subset of a large number of TTPs that are defined in industry standard frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK, DEFEND, and Engage. These TTPs help us set the baseline for threat intelligence that you will use to detect threats. Now I'd like to invite Shane on stage to help us understand how MITRE frameworks like attack, defend, and engage help in threat detection and remediation. Thank you.
Thank you. So, just to give a little context on myself, I started out my career in the late 90s doing IT/OT security infrastructure, and later moved on to, for a large food organization, and later moved on to doing some kill chain analysis and kill chain methodology, then leading up to 2015, bringing attack framework as it started to develop within the larger organizations that I was working within. And in 2018, I came to MITRE to actually build a bridge between cyber resiliency and the attack framework. So that was somewhat my first charge. And so as a result, let's start talking about the frameworks. The ones I'll be talking about today are attack, defend, and engage. So from the attacker's perspective, what is attack? So for anyone who might not know much about attack, I'm hoping to give you like a couple-minute crash course on attack. But what's really key is attack is a knowledge base of adversary behavior. It's an iteration of the things that an adversary can do, might likely do, or has done. But the real key to it, it's based on real-world observations. So it's not based on proof of concepts or theoretical, but it's based on real-world observations, what folks have seen and reported. And the interesting part about the attack framework is it was originally born of an idea of taking a hyper-censored lab and with real people doing real things, creating lived-in noise, real work on a everyday basis, and making that hyper-censored lab, hyper-censored at the endpoint, at the network, and engaging adversaries. And then gathering up the TTPs that they tend to share, or seeing what the artifacts are that were laid down. And so as a result, that was part of how attack was born. And then actually my first project at MITRE was to help a few others run the lab that made attack, and I learned a bunch from that. But the key part is it's based on real-world observations. Other key parts is, hey, it's free and open for anybody to come and engage in. So it's out there, attack.mitre.org. It's part of our public interest mission to have that out there. And as part of that, folks from all levels, from students to SOC analysts to vendors, can go and go out to the attack website and see what's out there, what things folks have entered, as well as what we've found. It's become a common language, so folks tend to now speak in TIDs and so forth, and I'll talk a little more about that, but tend to speak in the attack techniques or the attack tactics. And as a result, that being a common language, it helps to bring folks onto the same playing field when they're talking across industries and across spaces. But one thing that it's really is key to understand as well is it's community driven. We don't see everything. We have to rely on folks to report and tell us what things they see, and bring that back within the attack community, and then also obviously give credits as contributors. So attack, it usually starts out with this why. Why would you want to go down creating a framework? Well, it's kind of interesting or simple. It really goes back to David Bianco's Pyramid of Pain. And that's where the adversaries have sets of things that they're doing, and the attackers have sets of things that they're doing, or the defenders have sets of things that they're doing, and trying to take the artifacts that are out there and see what are indicators of compromise. Things from the adversary's perspective are somewhat easy to change, like a hash value. You can change a single bit, and that changes the hash value. It gets a little, little harder, but not much harder for changing IP addresses, changing domains. So as you start to summit the pyramid of pain, the adversary's life starts to get harder and more annoying at the host or artifact level, and definitely more challenging, once you force them to swap out their tool sets. They have to, gain initial access again and maybe get a tool set in. But where attack is kind of the sweet spot is at the top of the pyramid of pain. It's really hard. We're creatures of habit. Attackers are creatures of habit. Changing out TTPs, that's where the real value is. So for those of you who might know, but I'll walk through this real quickly, there's the attack framework as a matrix. And here we have across the top are the tactics. So the adversary's technical goals. So their technical goal might be to get initial access and therefore go to a point that they can go and potentially exploit locally and then laterally move. So each going across the top from initial access all the way through execution, all the way down to collection and impact, those are all the technical goals that an adversary might have. But then going down, we have the how those goals are achieved. So the techniques that the adversary might want to use or leverage in order to get the goal of initial access, in order to get the goal of collection, the goal of lateral movement. And some of those are shared across multiple tactics, but some of them sit mainly within a tactic category. But going down a little further, just looking at, say, a particular technique like phishing here, there might be a set of sub-techniques that go beneath that, like in this case, spear phishing attachment or spear phishing link or spear phishing via service. So as a result, you've got yourself different levels of kind of abstraction down to an actual sub-technique level. And then even further yet, it's down to the procedure level. Well, what threat group might have perform this particular action? So going all the way down to the procedure level is also key and within the framework and defined. But taking a step back, let's just look at the technique of phishing. There's a high-level description with each of the techniques as it's entered into the attack framework, and then there's also potentially links to other things. Like in this case, it's got a link to valid accounts. So why would you maybe want to send a spear phishing link? It's to get a valid account. So those relationships might show up within a particular technique or sub-technique, and you'll see that within the framework. But if you dig down just a little deeper, either at the technique level or at the sub-technique level, you'll see that TID or that ID. So each one of the techniques or sub-techniques are uniquely identified by an ID number. And you'll see that as right here, 1566.001 is a sub-technique to the technique or tactic or technique of 1566, phishing. And then initial access is the tactic level. And then you'll see the platforms where it makes, where these techniques or sub-techniques are performed on, Linux, Windows, OS. And then, as I said, community-driven, so, there's a contributor here. Each of the techniques may or may not have a mitigation. So there's 44 mitigations within attack. You can go out and you can see per technique or sub-technique if there's a mitigation that might apply, something that might be useful for you to understand, either to mitigate for detection or to mitigate the actual technique itself. And so they're also uniquely labeled, as you can see, as an MID here, M1049 antivirus or 1031, network intrusion prevention. But you also need to understand, all right, I need to be able to know how to detect that these techniques have been used. And so you can go out and look back out to, all right, where are the data sources where I might need information in order to build up that level of this is the technique that was used. So as a result, there's data sources, so application logs, file, and so forth. And they're also uniquely labeled. And this is where you kind of get the idea that if you don't have a data source, you're likely not going to be able to detect potentially a particular technique. So it's key to understand that there's relationships that go between them. So, crash course, you might say, what are the use cases for attack? There's the obvious use case of sharing information about detection. How do we get folks to understand what techniques have been used and how do we detect that they've been used? What are the indicators? And so there's the detection use case. There's the threat intelligence use case. So gathering this up across multiple threat groups, how can we overlay what maybe multiple threat groups are doing, see what are shared TTPs, and then therefore figure out how to block them from a particular shared space, so you can block more than one threat group. There's the assessment and engineering use case where you're looking to assess what your gaps are. So just like I talked about, data sources might not be present. So as a result, you're going to want to know, all right, where are my gaps, where my telemetry or my sensoring is not as good, and therefore I need to figure out a way to get a capability in play. And then there's the adversary emulation portion. I talked about attack being born of a real lab. Well, one of the things that was interesting during my time helping with that lab was that there were cyber games. We were doing live fire, lived in noise, and those folks were working every day, and we were able to emulate and not affect them in their work, but still emulate what the adversary was doing and figure out how to create potentially more TTPs from our red team, or in some cases, adversary engagement, really making it happen with real stuff. So that was a crash course on attack. Let's talk about, change our perspective a little bit to defend. So if you wander out on a lot of security conference floors, you see thousands of vendors. They might have multiple products doing multiple things. From a security architect or engineer standpoint, you're trying to figure out, all right, how do I distill this down into a manageable engineering problem that I can then engineer and be able to bring in defensive cyber countermeasures that would make sense, and that's actually relational to, say, something like attack. Well, because of that significant confusion in kind of the vendor space, there's no vocabulary really shared amongst those vendors. So we decided to come up with one. And so Peter Kalamarkis and his team have come up with DEFEND. And it's a knowledge base and a formal model. It's really trying to go and iterate through an ontology method, which I'll talk about in a second, the same elements of, all right, if we look at our environment, our infrastructure, how can we break this down into digital artifacts? And then those digital artifacts, do they have relationships between the attacker and the defender? And so as a result, there's, from the Defend website, there's, over 500 digital artifacts with relationships between attackers and defenders within there. It's digital artifacts of computers, things that both sides might be able to do: computers, networks, databases, files, processes. And how does that relate in a knowledge graph, which you see here on the right, and how do we put that into practice? Well, I'm going to do one other thing and show you a bottom line up front, and that is Peter and his team have recently put out Defend CAD. So not only were we breaking it down manually, but now with CAD, you can go and actually build your own breakdown of the Defend framework, of those relationships, so that you have a knowledge graph that you've built on your own, and in the background, you're able to go, all right, these are the things that I need in order to understand what are the architectural implications as a cyber defender, and then what are the, from the attacker's point of view, where do I have the gaps so that I can bring those all together? But it's meant for detection engineering, meant for CTI reporting, and that adversary emulation in red team, blue team pen test type scenarios. And as I said, it's out there, it's under defend, but it's it's free for anyone to go and engage and use. You can import JSON files of your particular from Attack Navigator and so forth, your particular challenges that you want to come in, and you can import and export those features as well as what graphs you save. So that's out there. But kind of digging into defend a little bit, so you say, all right, well, I've heard you talk about these digital artifacts. How does that really work? Well, for, say, process injection, so you're as an attacker, it's born of attack. The offensive model being, hey, I've got an exploitation for privilege escalation. My goal is to modify some process code segment and do so by process injection. So there's an offensive relationship, which actually is also something that a defender would want to do. You'd want to verify that there was no process code injection in play. So that relationship brings us to a digital artifact ontology. There's an offensive relationship that modifies, and there's a defensive relationship that verifies. So bringing that all together allows for you to, hey, if I get something that may detect this inferred challenge of modification, then I have now, somewhat described a cyber defensive countermeasure to the attacker's point of view. So that's what you see with defend. And what's really interesting, as I said, is there's 500 artifacts currently out there, and the control mappings that go between defend and then attack, and back to the digital ontology method. So it kind of brings us to the point of, all right, what does defend become? It becomes a unified ontological model for customer domains, and definitely across multiple customer domains. Like, cyber architects, cyber engineers being able to talk with the same language, share the same vocabulary, much like we've had with attack. Threats, countermeasures, and vulnerabilities and weaknesses, we can now talk in the same language. It also allows for use cases like detection engineering and MBSE or model-based system engineering, where you're trying to talk with folks who might not be cyber experts. And then, in the end, it really serves as a systems reference architecture. And it allows for you to kind of build out that, those elements and capability. And now with, free tools like Build Your Own CAD, in a sense, you're able to go and do that on your own and save those out. Also, I'll point out the OCSF element. So under the covers, obviously there's that OCSF element that it gives you the ability to, perform hunting operations potentially with Amazon Security Lake. And so there is a free trial for Amazon Security Lake. It's 15 days, so it's, there's always an option to try and exercise some of these elements. But on the defense side, one thing I want to point out is it's gained popularity, significant traffic to the website. Peter watches it quite closely, and it's got this growing Slack space for defend, and so there's obviously spaces for engagement there, and equally so, the team looks for those contributions back to not only the ontology but also to the code base. And I think that it's definitely something, if you take a couple of things away, defend and CAD are things to definitely check out. So engage. So we're switching gears yet again. So I've talked about attack from the attacker's perspective. I've talked about defend from the defender's perspective. And so we like puns and metaphors. So this damn metaphor works as both. And it's true. Adversaries are an endless stream. They, you stop what you can, but eventually somebody's going to get in. And from within the cyber resiliency space, I always say the ever-present, ever-adapting adversary that you don't know when they got in, you don't know how, but you still have to operate through, and you still have to achieve business or mission. So as a result, understanding that these things, this is something that you need to keep in mind. But luckily, there's some vulnerabilities to adversaries' plans, and that is that they follow a path of least resistance oftentimes. So, understanding you can channel them away from your key or critical assets, crown jewels, and maybe even channel them towards places where you have better telemetry, better censoring, and therefore you're driving them to a space where you can interact more. That becomes somewhat key. You make their job more difficult, and slow and limit the impact that you have, and also get information from them early. And so giving yourself every opportunity to find them early, find them often, and planning tripwires along the way of those likely paths really gives you a different advantage, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So, from the kind of the basis of adversary engagement, what do you mean? Well, cyber denial is behavior to conceal facts and fictions to create ambiguity to adversaries, that they don't understand what is real and what is not. Whereas cyber deception is defenders' behavior to reveal facts, fictions, and actively reinforce the adversary's perceptions, cognitions, and beliefs. So what's interesting is these two things form the foundation for adversary engagement. And I leave it to you like this. Oftentimes, one of my colleagues, Dr. Sambar, will get up and tell stories about, hey, adversary engagement, understanding that if you always tell the truth, then that's going to be somewhat of an issue. But if you lie, you tell the truth a couple of times to your adversary, let them see a particular endpoint is connected, let them see a particular account is in play, and then you start lying to them, adversaries will switch gears and say, hey, I now believe this element, and I want to believe. So you're changing their perceptions based on what you reveal as fact or fiction, and start to shape kind of the battlefield for where they will operate. And that's really where strategic planning and adversary engagement comes into play, shaping that, the planning and analysis to shape your next steps. So let's look at that. So the idea is that you're looking to expose malicious activities earlier, rapidly and earlier. You're looking to elicit those timely attacks, surface relevant elements, and do that in terms of CTI. So in terms of an adversary that might be, you have an idea early what they're doing, and then later in their attack life cycle, you have an idea what they likely will be doing. And then you're looking to negatively affect the elements by driving up their costs. And I actually look at it as a project plan from the adversary. So project plans, you have the ability, if you refer back to the PMI's Iron Triangle, you have the ability to potentially mess with scope, cost, quality, and time. And interestingly enough, cyber deception and cyber denial is about that. You're kind of looking to expand the scope of what they have to shoot at. You're looking to elongate the time it takes for them to understand what is present, eviscerate the quality of the data that they dump, and then also up the costs, because they might need to bring in new tools. They might need to validate information that they've dumped. So if you don't do anything early in the attack lifecycle before boom, unfortunately, that means everything you've told them is true, and they have clear line of sight and picture of all the things that they have the ability to shoot at. Whereas if you inject some element of non-truths in the mix with adversary engagement, you get the advantage across the entire attack lifecycle, from before boom to boom and after boom in order to not only get the information and tactics that might be in play, but also to understand post-boom, what you're going to need for incident response and so forth. But you obviously not giving up throughout the entire attack lifecycle. So that's really what you're looking to do, is create that knowledge of the threat landscape and then degrade adversaries' discovery overall. So let's dive into the Engage framework. So I throw this out there. It's part of the the starter kit on the Engage website. But there's the steps. There's the steps from 1 through 6, and then 7, and then understand 8 through 10. Now, I will throw this out there that everybody wants to jump to operate. It's a fun place, no doubt, but that's not to your advantage. I'll tell you that prepare is most important. So bringing yourself through 1 and 6 and preparing is key, because otherwise what happens, and this happens sometimes with folks that go down the adversary engagement route, is, hey, I've jumped to operate, and unfortunately I haven't got the right folks in mind. I haven't really defined what my goal would be. And so as a result, they sometimes get kicked out of ever doing an adversary engagement again, based on failing not to prepare. So I throw it out there that you need to prepare, and you need to do so thoroughly. And then obviously get through operate, and I'll talk about that in a second, and then get to understand. But at the high level, so I've talked about the construct of preparing, but going and operating, there's things that are kind of familiar in here, folks might recognize as part of deception or adversary engagement operations, things like lures, things like personas, things like pocket litter, seeking to expose, affect, elicit. Those are things that it's great to understand that how to do each one of those things. There's tools that can help you, but there's also live off the land type techniques. And so you'll probably see more about this in the future. This is live off the land from a deception perspective or adversary engagement perspective, where you're using things that are already present on an endpoint that might be key. So what does that really help you to do? Well, in the end, you're looking so that when an adversary performs a particular or a specific action, that you're looking to see what that vulnerability to the action is. Like I said to you before, if you tell them the truth all the time, then their line of sight is perfect. And if you don't, and you start to kind of engage in the element of adversary engagement, then that it's susceptible to manipulation, and therefore should be one of those things that you engage as a defender to take advantage of as a defensive purpose. And in this case, we take remote system discovery, so you see what systems are connected to a system. And if, as I said to you before, if you don't lie to them, then everything is perfect. And then when you do lie to them, when adversaries interact with that information through lures, then you've obviously created that friction, that noise. You see them early, you see them more often, and you might actually influence in some ways. They might bug out. So in that sense, you still potentially win. So as a result, that's where engagement with real adversary behavior comes in. So as part of that, adversary engagement has the potential to be a game changer. I've been doing cyber deception work since around 2014, dealing with tools that sit in that space, and it is a game changer. Sometimes you can shift your investments that would be in other tools that are really kind of focused on the post-bang scenarios, and shift those costs to other places within an organization. And that makes it so that you can drive adversaries or drive them out in some cases. But we need folks to kind of prove out that value in their own spaces. And so getting folks to understand and test that value proposition is key. And Engage and the Engage planner and the things that are out there are really meant to kind of pull together and start that conversation. And we need those, you folks to keep that conversation going. So I bring this to, all right, I've talked about MITRE ATT&CK, I've talked about MITRE DEFEND, I've talked about MITRE Engage. So there's one thing that kind of sits in the very middle here, and it's, I sit on the cyber resiliency team. So anticipate, withstand, recover, and adapt. I also help with each of the other 3 frameworks. But as a result, I would say that cyber resiliency actually sits in the middle. The attacker is looking to overcome your defenses, anticipate your defenses. They're looking to withstand and recover quickly. They're looking to adapt and make their next round more effective. So as a result, cyber resiliency, even if the attacker doesn't realize it, they're using it. The defender, obvious, we just talked about that. And Engage, we're looking to take advantage of the disadvantages that the attacker has when told truth and lies. So as a result, I'd say cyber resiliency sits in the middle, anticipate, withstand, recover, and adapt. And I help with the CREF Navigator as part of the cyber resiliency engineering framework and some of the work that goes in that space. But for this discussion, we're talking about what can be done with a threat catalog for AWS. And so we've done some partnered research, created the TTC for AWS, and that's what you see here with the QR code. It can be used as a reference to identify tactics relevant to AWS and used by your organization. It can also provide ways to tune those detection methodologies and display relevant mitigation configurations. And so I have this up here, get the QR code, take a look. And now I will turn it over to Shahar.
Thank you so much, Shane. Curious, by a quick show of hands, how many of you have heard about GuardDuty in the past? Okay, I see lots of hands, which is great. Not all the hands, so hope to fix that after today. And how many of you are using GuardDuty in your environment? Okay, about the same conclusion. Great, so I'll do a quick crash course on what GuardDuty is, how it can help you better secure your AWS environment, and we'll talk about the connection between MITRE and GuardDuty and how it can help you reach better outcomes by the mapping that GuardDuty has to MITRE framework. So GuardDuty is the threat detection service for AWS environments. The metaphor I like to think about GuardDuty is as the canary for your cloud environment. If something goes wrong, GuardDuty will alert you that there is some suspicious activity in a specific account or workload that you should take a look at. And if something is really bad, we'll make sure to alert you in a more prominent manner. It's a fully managed service, which means that we enable one-click enablement across your entire organization or in a specific account if you would like. You don't need to set up any infrastructure, enable any logs, log sources, or really do anything to make GuardDuty up and running, except for enabling the service itself. And once it's up, GuardDuty continuously monitors your AWS environment across different data sources that we will address really soon. And the way we do it is by combining both machine learning algorithms, stateless rules, and stateful rules that are continuously tuned and improved by our unique visibility into the AWS threat landscape to ensure that we continuously detect both common threats as well as emerging threats as attackers continue to adapt their techniques. And that really ties to a lot of what Shane discussed earlier, where we have, let's say, the tactics don't change materially, or at least not often, and the techniques change, let's say, but not super frequently. But the specific sub-techniques and procedures, we actually see a lot of let's call it innovation in a way, by the way attackers always try to undermine and go around existing detection tools. And therefore, we always keep track and invest a lot of resources to make sure we detect these emerging techniques as well. And part of the fact that enables us to stay on track on what is emerging and new and novel is very extensive threat intelligence that we have, both threat intelligence that is produced by AWS, as well as threat intelligence that we get from third-party partners. So a bit about the scale and visibility we have. One of the things that we use to be able to detect suspicious and malicious domains, oftentimes weeks before we see them within other threat intelligence providers, is called MITRE. MITRE is one of the largest neural networks in the world, and we really use it to map network traffic that we observe as AWS to detect domains that could look more suspicious. And then we use various internal techniques to validate whether they are indeed suspicious or in fact malicious. Another resource that we have that is also AWS internal is called MedBot. There is actually a great blog about MedBot. I would recommend if you would just Google AWS blog MedBot, you can learn a lot more about it. But it's really a global network of honeypots that allows us to detect malicious activity and new ways that attackers are trying to either perform reconnaissance or more impactful activities in AWS environments. And lastly, a bit about the scale that GuardDuty operates. GuardDuty is used by over 95% of the top 2,000 customers of AWS, used by tens of thousands of customers across virtually every industry, geography. And what that allows us is very big visibility into activity in AWS environments. So just to give a demonstration about the scale we operate, last Prime Day, and maybe some of you were responsible to part of that activity. I know I bought a lot of things. Last Prime Day, GuardDuty monitored nearly 6 trillion events per hour, and that is an increase of over 30% compared with last year. So we really operate on an unprecedented scale that allows us to then take that visibility and create better detections on your behalf for you to improve your cloud security. So let's dive a bit deeper on what exactly do we monitor and how it works. Today, GuardDuty monitors multiple log sources. When we started GuardDuty, and that is what is foundational GuardDuty that you get when you enable GuardDuty itself, we monitor CloudTrail, DNS logs, and VPC flow logs. That allows us visibility into the foundational detection. It's really the control plane activity in the cloud and network activity. But then we continue to expand our visibility over the past 5 years, really. And now we cover S3 data events, EKS audit logs. We have an on-host sensor that you can deploy in EC2, ECS Fargate, and EKS. And we cover Lambda flow logs, as well as malware scanning. So a lot of different things, as you can gather from this, and we'll cover more about the specific capabilities in a moment. And the mental framework that I like to work with customers on, because you have a lot of options. And then the question is, OK, so what should I actually use, right? Because the recommendation and the easiest thing to do is to enable everything. But if you want to enable kind of like one step at a time and want to think through what should I have in place, then I would typically recommend thinking about the infrastructure you have deployed in your cloud environment and work from there. So if, for example, you use mainly EC2s and S3, it's kind of like the more classic cloud infrastructure. You can enable foundational GuardDuty and S3 protection, and we'll go over the names of the protection plans. But if for example, you have Lambda deployed in your cloud environment as well, then you might want to think about Lambda protection. So this kind of like matching infrastructure with the security protection is how I like to think about it. And once it's enabled, these different protection plans, we get these logs straight from the source, which means you don't need to enable anything on your end. You don't need, for example, to enable VPC flow logs for us to process VPC flow logs, which allows you to save on cost and storage, as well as just simplify the deployment, obviously. And we use the combination of the threat intelligence I mentioned before, as well as algorithms we develop in-house to be able to detect suspicious and malicious activity. This algorithm produces over 175 types of findings, where each finding type corresponds to a specific threat, really. So for example, one finding type would be crypto mining activity or data exfiltration in S3. One unique advantage that you get by using GuardDuty is that no one can interrupt the monitoring. Since we're getting the logs straight from the source, for example, S3 data events, first you don't need to enable S3 data events to be able to get the monitoring, but also, even if attacker gains access to your cloud environment, if they turn off or disable S3 data events, we will still get them, process them, and alert you on any malicious activity, because again, we get it straight from the source. And once the findings are created, they can be consumed in the GuardDuty console, AWS Security Hub, which is our CNAPP offering, Amazon Detective for investigation. And if you want to forward it to your other security tools, you can use EventBridge for a more event-driven architecture, or export the findings to S3 and then pull the findings from there. So this is, from your perspective, when you come to enable GuardDuty or the different protection plans, this is how it will look like. And the log sources that I mentioned are offered as distinct protection plans. So for example, S3 protection helps you detect malicious activity that relates to your S3 bucket, such as data exfiltration or data destruction. Another example is RDS protection. RDS protections allow you to detect primarily brute force attacks, where we observe all the different login attempts, whether they are successful or unsuccessful, and then alert you if, for example, there were 100 attempts to log in to a specific RDS instance, that all of them failed, and then one attempt was successful, for example. And that was done from a new location that typically is not used in that AWS account. And that's obviously something you might want to take a look into. Each of these protection plans come with a 30-day free trial. So you can test it out, compare it, run evaluation on the different value propositions that you want to get as a security engineer or security professional, and also use a public finding tester that we have that simulates attacks. We recommend running it in a sandbox account, just to be sure. But basically, it spins up infrastructure, conducts activity that simulates an attack, and then tears down the infrastructure. And that can help you evaluate the different protection plans. And obviously, there is also third-party frameworks that allow you to simulate attacks as well. So just on the protection plans, I also want to add we have runtime monitoring, which allows you to gain more visibility into on-host activity. That is particularly important if you're using containerized workloads, such as EKS or ECS, because that additional visibility that is provided by the sensors allows us to detect, for example, that if there was a crypto mining activity, which specific container and which process within it triggered that activity, and what was the whole process tree that led up to that moment, as well as the container image that was pulled in a case of supply chain attack, all into a specific finding. whereas even with the foundational GuardDuty in place, you will still be alerted that there was some most likely crypto mining activity that happened on the EC2 instance, but you wouldn't be able to discern which specific container triggered it because we're monitoring the VPC flow logs and DNS logs in the case of foundational GuardDuty. So the way I'd like to think about it is if you really need and want that additional level of visibility, the runtime monitoring offering is something good to consider. So I won't go over all the protection plans in detail, but again, the recommendation from my perspective is to think through the different workloads that you have, the different infrastructure you deploy in your environment, and then match it with the different GuardDuty protection plans that are applicable to this infrastructure. So what we heard from customers over the past years was initially they wanted more scope of visibility into specific types of attacks. So for example, we added the coverage for EKS, both in terms of EKS control plane and then EKS runtime monitoring to be able to detect attacks in such kind of workloads. But then as we expanded the visibility, what you get is many different types of findings. And while most of these findings, where applicable, are mapped, for example, to MITRE framework to help you understand, okay, this type of finding in GuardDuty, what does it translate to in the really universal language of cybersecurity? You still need to triage and investigate many different types of findings, and the volume of findings keep increasing because the activity in cloud environments just scales. And one thing I never heard from a customer is them telling me, you know what, I actually don't get enough alerts on my security tools. You know, it's just too quiet around here. I just sit here and I don't have anything to do. It typically is the opposite way around. So what we released last reInvent about 6 months ago to be able to address the need of customers of understanding how different security alerts relate to each other and which alerts are really the ones that they should evaluate most carefully is called GuardDuty Extended Threat Detection. This capability is enabled automatically with no additional cost. So for the ones who already raised their hand and said they're using GuardDuty, you already have that enabled. And this capability automatically uses AI and ML technology to correlate different activity and put together the puzzle on what is the most pressing and highest confident threats in your cloud environment. So it will correlate both strong signals, which are GuardDuty findings, as well as weak signals that are activity that we see on our side, but don't send out to you to not overwhelm customers with findings. And we'll put it together into a single critical severity attack sequence, which is a new type of finding that we released last reInvent. And this attack sequence will contain the full attack chain, all the different activities that we observed in a single timeline, and we'll see it in a moment. And that allows you to focus on these alerts first, instead of evaluating the individual events that come in on an ongoing basis. The value from your perspective is that you need to spend less time on the really first level analysis of evaluating each individual finding and trying to figure out how the findings relate to each other, and more time focusing on investigating these validated threats. And after, it's been 6 months now, I can tell you that the true positive rate of these types of findings is very high. I can't quote the exact number because it's tricky from that perspective, but I would strongly recommend seriously evaluating every attack sequence that is being created. And what types of attack sequences we have? Right now, we have 2 types of attack sequences, with a third one coming pretty soon. I would stay tuned for the rest of this week. And the first one is compromised identity. Compromised identity which is typically a compromise of long-term AWS credentials, remains the main initial access attack vector to cloud environments. And the second one is compromised data, as data is most often the most important organizational assets that you have in your cloud environment. In the first case of compromised credentials, we will detect a sequence of actions that typically translates to multiple stages in the MITRE ATT&CK framework and put them together into a single finding for you to be able to evaluate and respond to. Similarly, in the compromised data finding, in that one, we are focusing more on data residing in S3 and looking for a series of actions that contain evidence to data exfiltration and data destruction. This one is also very applicable for ransomware events. We just don't position it as ransomware because we don't see the claim for ransom. But I would, again, strongly recommend looking and evaluating these findings. And the third one that might come up fairly soon relates to compromised EKS clusters in your cloud environment. And there we correlate activity from foundational GuardDuty, S3 protection, EKS protection, which is EKS audit logs monitoring, and EKS runtime monitoring, which relates to the on-host activity, to detect a compromise relating to the cluster. So for example, a use case can be a compromised credential that leads to a creation of a new Kubernetes user, launching a new privileged container that is then being used for crypto mining activity. And instead of you having to put together 20 different events and understand how they relate to each other, you just get a single finding that already outlays the full timeline of events. So let's take a look at these findings. And I do apologize that it is a bit small, so I will talk about what exists there. The first part of the finding, and this is a compromised credential finding, outlays the different activity that happened. In this case, we correlated 5 different signals across a multiple hours time frame. And what you can probably can't see is that in the summary, we already tell you, hey, we saw multiple MITRE attack tactics used as a part of this event, as well as MITRE attack techniques that we observed. In this case, for example, modification of cloud logs and data exfiltration. In the middle of the page, just under the attack sequence, you can see that we outlaid the MITRE tactics that were observed. So you can see the attack chain and then see which activities were already identified. And if you click on one of these, it will show you the specific findings that were associated with this part of the MITRE framework. So even if you don't know the exact GuardDuty finding type, you can still easily understand that, okay, there was some activity that happened relating to impact or execution, and then I can drill down and see the specific GuardDuty finding that is associated with that stage. And on the right-hand side, you can see the different signals that we correlated. Each box is one finding or other weak signal. And on the rightmost side of it, we put the tags that correspond to the MITRE framework, MITRE ATT&CK framework, for this activity. And under each activity, you can see the exact resources involved with it. The first one is deletion of objects from S3 for a specific S3, in a specific S3 bucket. And then you can learn about a specific bucket that activity related to, the credentials that was used to make the API call, and more details to help you get context. One last thing that we have here, and that's the right tab. I don't have a screenshot of it. Is the resources tab. That's a very powerful pivot view because it can help you quickly identify which resources were involved in this attack sequence. So you can see, for example, the S3 buckets that were compromised, the access key that is likely compromised as well, and then mitigate and focus your response on these specific resources. So thank you all so much for spending your first hour of Reinforce with us. We're really grateful for you waking up early in the morning and coming to spend this hour with us. Thank you so much. We're going to stick around here if you have any questions or follow-up. And this is our names if you have any follow-up as well. And have a fantastic Reinforce.